Hello, welcome to Music Education Courses. Now, today we are going to uh, start with an intro to the performance aspect of a GCSE course. So, first of all, our aim for this lesson is to understand what to expect for the performance component of a music GCSE course. Our objectives are, first of all, to identify the structure of the performance component of a music GCSE qualification. Then we're going to move on to understand the expectations of the performance component of a music GCSE qualification. That's expecting the expectations on the student as well as the teacher, and then accurately interpret the grading criteria and assessment requirements for the performance component. So, first of all, we're going to identify the structure. We're going to start off with Edexcel. This whole lesson is based on the Edexcel qualification, the 9-to-1 spec, and the overview is that the performance component is 30% of the overall grade. There's performance, composition, and then the exam. Uh, Performance is 30%, composition 30%, exam 40%. A total of 60 marks available for the performance component. The performance time must be minimum of 4 minutes of music. So it doesn't count the introductory time, it doesn't count any breaks in between pieces. If you're doing multiple pieces for either the solo or ensemble, it's purely the amount of time that there is music. So make sure that there's a stopwatch or something which keeps track of the amount of time that you are actually actively performing. The marks will be reduced proportionally for each individual second under 4 minutes. So please make sure you're on top of that. For solo, the solo can get you 30 marks. It must be at least 1 minute long. It can be multiple pieces if you don't get up to that 1 minute minimum, and must be a different piece to the ensemble. The ensemble, again, must be a different piece to the solo. It consists of 30 marks. It must be at least 1 minute long, and it can be multiple pieces. Exactly the same. So for that 4 minutes, for the overall marks, please make sure that each is at least 1 minute, but overall 4 minutes. Hence why each of them can be more than one piece, depending on what you feel more comfortable doing. My advice is to make the solo the more dominant part of your performance component, because then you're only relying on yourself. You yourself are entirely responsible for the grade, whereas ensemble, you need to rely a little bit on others. So, now moving on to the next part, understanding the expectations of the performance component. Let's look at the overview here. Students choose the song. Obviously, always seek advice from your teacher, your instrumental or vocal teacher, as well as your classroom teacher. They are going to know, and they need to communicate with each other as well. If recording more than one piece for solo or ensemble, they must be recorded together. No editing. I said that before. Guided maximum time 6 minutes. However, you will not be penalized for going over that. However, Edexcel in the spec say that if you do go over that, it can become self-penalizing, meaning that you may tire yourself out throughout the performance, or there is more room for error. As you may see in the assessment grids later, sometimes it says there are no more than 1 or 2 less successful parts. The longer you play, the more space there is for 1 or 2 errors, or even more. So, for the solo, if an accompaniment is written, this accompaniment must be performed. If you're submitting a notated score or whatever, if there is accompaniment, it must be performed as well. So make sure you find an accompanist, either your teacher, a fellow student, or your instrumental or vocal teacher, perhaps. You can use a backing track, vocalists, very, very useful, or lead guitarists. But this track must not contain the track being performed. This is the frustrating part for instrumentalists, not so much for vocalists, because there are backing tracks galore for you vocalists out there. And they offer a rigid tempo as well for you to stick to, which will be very, very useful, as you'll see later on in the assessment criteria. For ensemble, it must have 2 or more performers. can be an accompanist, so it can be linked to a solo. If you have a strong pianist or guitarist that can accompany a vocalist, then it's usually best to do that because live accompany uh, always sounds better and can react to the vocal part or other instrumental part and lift them up and actually give them more opportunity for a dynamic range than a backing track can. So if you've got really strong accompanist or the teacher has enough time on their hands to be able to learn it and play it well, or perhaps the instrumental tutor, whatever it may be, then you can do that. But if you've got a really strong student, you can link it. The student can be assessed as an accompanist for their ensemble, whilst the vocalist or other instrumentalist can be assessed for the solo. The assessed student's part must not be doubled by any other part, so no other part can be playing the same thing. Even if it's a vocalist doing lyrics instead, but doing the same melody as a piano part, for example, underneath, the piano part is doing the same part, it must not be doubled. And more than one student may be assessed for ensemble. That just makes sense, especially in sort of a band situation. So, items for submission. Students need to be aware of this as well as the teachers. Students, remember, it's your responsibility just as much as a teacher to make sure that this is all done and that you provide what needs to be provided. The recording part needs to be complete and unedited. So, also, no editing of like editing out any quiet parts or anything like that. It also shouldn't have any extra effects on it or anything like that in order to try and enhance the performance. It needs to be of the live performance in front of the teacher, so it doesn't need to be in front of an audience per se, usually best practice, but depending on the situation, it needs to at the very least be in front of the teacher. And it needs to start with an announcement of the student saying the candidate number, name, instrument, and the part they're playing, and that's submitted online. Also, another really good thing about Edexcel is they're the only specification that actually give a clear date on when it must be submitted. So sent and received by 15th of May in the year of certification, so during year 11. The score needs to be submitted as well. It can be a notated score, it can be a lead sheet, which is especially useful for improvised performances. It can be a professional reference recording. So again, if you're using a backing track, you can submit the original track on top of that as well that actually has the original part being played, so your part can be referenced in the original recording. Performances from a score must be accurate, so for example, tab with no rhythm is unacceptable. Deviations, or so moving away from the score, will be accepted as long as they are stylistically appropriate. And for sequenced performances, only the live recording will be assessed, not just the pre-recorded sequenced parts exported as a WAV or MP3 file. And they also need to be submitted with an authentication sheet, which must be completed by the teacher, but signed by the teacher and the student. Each student has a separate track, individually labeled with their center number, candidate number, and title. Now, if the moderation indicates that centre assessment does not reflect national standards, an adjustment will be made to students' final marks to compensate. That's for the overall grade. So, what happens is your teacher is the assessor. Your centre is your school or college. So, after it's been assessed and your teacher has given you a grade, your teacher or assessor, it then gets sent off to be moderated by a moderator, someone who works for Edexcel who checks grades across various different schools and colleges. And if the assessment given by your teacher does not reflect national standards, so it doesn't reflect how well or poorly people did, students did across the whole nation, then an adjustment will be made to students' final marks to compensate. So if loads of people did really poorly, then grade boundaries may be adjusted to allow people with slightly less marks to get a higher grade. If way too many people did really well, then the grade boundaries may be adjusted so that people would need slightly more marks in order to access higher grades. It all depends on how well or poorly people do nationally. Now, we are moving on to the next objective. Accurately interpret the grading criteria and assessment requirements for the performance component. So, the Edexcel assessment criteria has three assessment grids. The first one that we're going to look at is technique, and throughout these grids, we're going to be looking primarily at keywords. So, for level 1, for 0, it just means that your performance was under 1 minute or didn't reach the the minimum 4 minutes overall, or you just had nothing. Level 1, for 1 to 2 marks, the performance overall demonstrates poor technical control as heard in poor coordination, breath control, or diction, which means how you pronounce lyrics, and or pedaling. So poor means very bad or hardly existing. From a teacher's perspective, from an assessor's perspective, that's what that keyword means. The demands of the music are beyond the current ability of the performer. The handling of sonority is poor, as heard in a dull, thin, coarse tone quality across the range. It's talking primarily about pitch range there, and or poor intonation, which means being in tune throughout. So throughout the whole performance, and or poor use of filters and effects. So you can still have a really poor performance and still get some marks, 1 or 2 marks. So that means that even if you're not very confident, there is still hope for you. You can still get some marks, and some marks is better than no marks. If you're one of those kinds of people who just gets really shy about performing, but you're an absolute whiz at composition and you're really good with your music theory, then you may be able to compensate with that. Next, for level 2, for 3 to 4 marks, it's exactly the same descriptors, except for some keywords have been changed. So here, instead of poor technical control, it says limited, which from a teacher's perspective means not much. There are a few places where the demands of the music are beyond the current ability of the performer. Few, to me, means 3 or more, because in other parts of the assessment criteria it says 1 or 2, and anything else it says a few or some. If it doesn't say a specific number, I like to go with 3 or more. That's to be on the safe side. And it's always best to err on the side of caution. The handling of sonority is limited, again, keyword, meaning not much, as heard in dull, thin, coarse tone quality. And as you can see, the rest of it stays the same. Here's an interesting point. If the difficulty of the music performed is at difficulty level 1, the mark awarded in this grid cannot exceed this level. Now, level 3, for 5 to 6 marks, the performance demonstrates basic technical control as heard in basic coordination, breath control, diction, and or pedaling. Basic meaning generally fit for purpose for a standard level song. That's how I interpret it as a teacher, and as having taught for 10 years, head of music, head of faculty, that's how I view it. Basic meaning generally fit for purpose for a standard level song. Then there's another key word is here, consistently, which means all that's the same all the way through. So where it says the handling of sonority is good, remember sonority means timbre, tone quality, as heard in consistently good tone quality. So consistently good all the way through, except at the extremities of the pitch range or at moments of technical difficulty and or good intonation and use of filters and effects. So consistently good tone quality except at extremities of pitch range, really high or really low, or moments of technical difficulty. If there's a really difficult part that means that you need to focus quite hard on technique during a certain part, you will be forgiven. Level 4, for 7 to 8 marks, the performance demonstrates convincing technical control. Convincing is a key word now, as heard in convincing coordination, breath control, diction, and or pedaling. Convincing, from a teacher's perspective, means obviously good with no room to doubt. That's what that means. from my perspective. Convincing, meaning obviously good with no room to doubt, so you are very secure. The demands of the music are within the ability of the performer, it's just obvious. The handling of sonority is convincing, as heard in very good tone quality across the pitch range, satisfying, interesting, and even as the music demands. There was an extra bit here as well, including, where appropriate, very good and sensitive tonal contrast throughout. So, sensitive is another key word, which means making small but effective changes. So if there's a particular cadenza or something, a little solo part, or coming up the build up at the end of a middle eight or something, you're making small but effective changes to your pronunciation, your diction, your articulation, or your dynamic contrast. Small but effective changes. Now, the second grid. Grid 2, expression and interpretation. For an absolute basic level, inappropriate or inconsistent tempo throughout. Inappropriate meaning different, and I would even go one step further to say contrasting to what is required. So a complete contrast to what is required. And inconsistent, it keeps changing. It's never the same. Little or no appropriate dynamic contrast, and little or no attention given to phrasing, which means a group of notes or note values, not individual notes, but say a whole melodic phrase or a whole rhythmic phrase or beat. And articulation, meaning clarity of expression. For example, how you pronounce your lyrics as a vocalist, or whether you're playing more staccato or legato, etc. That's articulation. And the performance communicates poorly. There's no emotion in it whatsoever. And in ensemble performances, there is little awareness of balance. We're going to go through what balance means in a future slide because it comes up in every part of the grid. Here, level 2, for 3 to 4 marks. There is an unsuitable or inconsistent tempo in places. So unsuitable meaning different to what is required, and the main key difference here is it says in places, so only sometimes. There's limited use of dynamics, phrasing and articulation to shape the performance. The performance struggles to communicate and may sound mechanical, so it's robotic. In other words, lacking emotion. And in ensemble performances, there is occasional awareness of balance. Occasional just means every now and then. Occasional, just like few. If I've got my assessment spreadsheet in front of me using shorthand, I always count 3 or more. Now, level 3, 5 to 6 marks. The use of tempo is usually appropriate and consistent. So from my perspective as a teacher, usually means most of the time, so more than 50%. Some use of dynamics, phrasing and articulation to shape the performance, but several opportunities, notated or otherwise, are missed. That's the only part in any grading criteria where I feel a moderator has wiggle room to argue to put grades slightly lower or higher. Otherwise, there's plenty more that teachers can put down in their teacher authentication sheet explaining why that specific grade was given to minimize argument and to make the job a lot easier for the moderator as well. Some use of dynamics and phrasing and articulation to shape the performance, but several opportunities, notated or otherwise, are missed. That's what that means. The performance demonstrates some involvement with the music. Involvement meaning an understanding of the emotional expression required for the piece. In ensemble performances, there is a good awareness of balance throughout. Now, level 4, stepping it up. For 7 to 8 marks, the use of tempo is appropriate and consistent throughout, meaning all the way through. Appropriate use of dynamics, phrasing, and articulation to shape the performance. I'll explain here, shape the performance means to keep it musically interesting to the listener. The performance communicates very well with no more than 1 or 2 less successful moments. And in ensemble performances, there is excellent awareness of balance throughout. Here's where I explain what is meant by balance. It's mostly talking about dynamic contrast between instruments and parts. That's the easiest way to analyze the balance and evaluate balance in an ensemble performance. But it can also be talking about lead and accompanying roles. Are they showing an awareness of balance? So if the lead part starts to do a particularly technical, difficult part, or a, a particularly difficult display of technique, is the accompaniment supporting them, playing a little bit quieter or a little bit louder if the lead part starts to increase dynamics as well? Are they showing an excellent awareness of balance throughout? So throughout all the way through. Now, for the third grid, accuracy and fluency for level 1. So the most absolute basic. The performance has several, 3 or more, noticeable and obtrusive errors. So noticeable, clearly noticeable, even to someone who doesn't know anything about music. Basically, a complete breakdown of a performance. Errors in pitch and or rhythm that impact on its success overall, that make it an obviously less successful performance. Coherence, which means holding together, and fluency are frequently compromised by breakdowns and or omissions. So the whole performance breaks down, you need to stop and start again. Or omission, a part is missing. Improvised performances demonstrate little accuracy when performing the stimulus and little development of this material. The improvisation will lack coherence and contrast. So when it's talking about stimulus, it's talking about what you're using as a basis for your improvisation. It can be chord sequence, it can be a rhythmic pattern, it can be a scale or a selection of notes, for example. In ensemble performances, there is evidence of difficulty in reacting and adjusting to other parts. Level 2. The performance has noticeable obtrusive errors or omissions in pitch and or rhythm that have little or no impact on its success overall. There are moments where coherence is lost with some hesitation and or omission, but the performance is still reasonably fluent for the majority of the piece. Improvised performances demonstrate some accuracy when performing the stimulus with limited development of the stimulus. The improvisation sounds repetitive, predictable, and or formulaic. In ensemble performances, there is occasional difficulty in reacting and adjusting to other parts. Level 3, for 5 to 6 marks. The performance has no more than 1 or 2 noticeable obtrusive errors or omissions in pitch and or rhythm that have minimal impact on its success overall. Minimal impact. So it's using specific numbers here. 1 or 2, they can be counted, that have minimal impact. So it doesn't result in a breakdown or forgetting a part. You manage to carry on. They are noticeable, but they don't impact the success overall. The performance is mostly coherent and fluent, despite the occasional, remember words like few or occasional, I count 3 or more, hesitation and or omission. Improvised performances demonstrate a mostly accurate performance and show some development of the stimulus. The improvisation attempts to create variety but may rely heavily on repetition and be predictable and or formulaic in places. In ensemble performances, there is generally good reaction and, where appropriate, adjustment to other parts. Level 4, 7 to 8 marks. The performance is largely accurate with no more than 1 or 2 minor errors in pitch and or rhythm. These errors have no impact on its success overall. The performance is coherent and fluent despite the occasional slight hesitation and or omission. So there's no impact on the success overall. There's occasional slight hesitation. So these mistakes would only really be picked up by a professional musician, such as your teacher or the moderator, but with no impact on the overall success of the performance. Improvised performances demonstrate an accurate performance of the stimulus and produce an interesting realization of the stimulus. The improvisation is coherent, well balanced, and effective throughout. In ensemble performances, a consistently responsive reaction and, where appropriate, adjustment to other parts is evident. So what I love about the Edexcel assessment criteria is it is very robust. It's very clear on what to look out for different types of performances. And even if you make mistakes, as long as they are small mistakes and not many, and you don't let it phase you, you don't let it create a breakdown of the performance, you can still get high marks. That is one of my favorite things about Edexcel is it does not rely on perfectionism, because in real life, even professional musicians make small, barely noticeable errors all the time. But the difference between an amateur and a professional is how well you can hide it and carry on with the performance, and make it feel and seem as though no mistake even happened. Now we're going to look at the raw mark conversion, because for each performance you get 8, 8, and 8 is marked out of 8. Each assessment grid gives you a raw mark of up to 24. If the difficulty is up to grade 3, then it's whatever the raw mark is. But remember, if it's grade 1, difficulty level 1, then you can't get above the second level, at least in terms of technique. Standard, grade 4, gives you a few more marks, and then more difficult, grade 5 and above, gives you even more. My advice for anyone who is grade 6 or above, stick with grade 5, because it's always better to go with the grade 5 that you're clearly going to perform a lot better. It's a lot safer of a bet to get that done, and then you can always work on grade 6 for AS level. Have that still in your back pocket, because it'll need to be a different song anyway. It needs to be grade 6 as a standard level for AS level, and grade 7 for AES. So keep working on that. But my advice is to use the assessment system for GCSE to your advantage as best as possible. Do a grade 5 if that's easier for you, so that you can get a more secure high mark. Now we're going to go through examples that Edexcel give in a different document for a standard level GCSE piece, what's expected for different instruments, and a standard level for A-level. Remember, grade 7 is the second year of A-level. The first year, so AS, is grade 6 for standard, for the middle line. So here are some examples for each instrument. And in the document, which I'm going to mention at the end of the video, the document that I got this from has clear examples on what to look for in order to not improve, but to look for as an example of a higher grade, of a higher difficulty than what is already there. And it's important as well to note that in the document that I've quoted all of these examples from, it says that a standard piece would include most of these examples. So not necessarily all of them, but most of them. So for example, GCSE, some independence between the hands, changes of hand position, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, use of the sustain pedal if appropriate, and some interplay between the other parts. For A-level, complete independence between the hands, frequent changes of hand position, complex rhythmic patterns, sophisticated control of dynamics and articulation, appropriate and effective use of the sustain pedal, and exposed lines or frequent interplay with other parts. So this one, I said the A-level example for as well, so that you can get an idea. If your GCSE one has most of those bullet points with 1 or 2 from the A-level, then it's a lot easier to explain why your chosen piece is higher than grade 4, if it has one or two of the technical demands of an A-level piece. So from now on, I'm just going to blast through the GCSE grade 4 standard examples of what would be included in a standard piece. So for brass, a pitch range greater than an octave, not all in an easy register for the instrument, some melodic leaps, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, phrasing that requires some breath control, and some interplay with the other parts. Strings example, coordination of the left hand and the bow, changes of left hand position, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Woodwind, a pitch range greater than an octave, not all in an easy register for the instrument, some melodic leaps, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, phrasing that requires some breath control, some interplay with the other parts. Voice or vocals, a pitch range greater than an octave, some melodic leaps up to at least a fourth, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, phrasing that requires some breath control, some interplay with the other parts. Keyboard, some independence and awareness of balance between the hands, some use of extended chords, changes of hand position, at least two pitch changes, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and or articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Classical guitar, two clear parts, some changes of left hand position, some variety in right hand technique, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Popular guitar, covering at least 4 strings, at least up to 5th position, some bar chords, moving between chords and single notes, including double stops on adjacent strings. Double stop, in case you don't know, just refers to a chord of 2 notes being played at the same time. Varied rhythmic patterns, some use of damping or muting, some control of dynamic contrasts and or articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Bass guitar. Bass line mainly uses notes from the chord, some changes of left hand position, varied rhythmic patterns, use of slapped and pulled notes, even use of fingers on the picking hand, some control of dynamic contrasts and or articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Drum kit, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and or articulation, some simple fills, some independence of limbs required, including use of open and closed hi-hat, some interplay with the other parts. Tuned percussion example. Some damping required, include some melodic leaps, varied rhythmic patterns, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Untuned percussion, varied rhythmic patterns, some use of decorations, rolls, flams and paradiddles, some control of dynamic contrasts and articulation, some interplay with the other parts. Now, the documents I quoted from in this video are the Pearson GCSE 9-1 grade music specification. I've got the pages there as well. GCSE Music Performance Assessment Grids Guidance, GCSE Music and Explanation of the Assessment Grids and New Administrative Features for Performance, and Difficulty Levels, Further Guidance for Ensemble Performances. That's the one that I'm going to be referring to in future lessons as well, where we discuss how to choose the perfect song for you personally for your solo and ensemble performances. So that's a document that I strongly recommend you Google, download, so you've got it to refer to and read through for your own specific instrument as well. Hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.